I interrupt your regularly scheduled False Friends video series to do two things. I want to discuss a common critique of my viewpoint on how language change affects our ability to read the King James, namely the idea that the King James uses something these critics call biblical English. And second, I want to do this by bringing you a nerdy exploration of a little phrase I initially assumed was a false friend and might still possibly be one, but which to the best of my judgment is not. And yet it still leads to misunderstandings among some, maybe many, modern readers and needs to be discussed. And if any of that sounds boring, this not false friend but maybe also has a funny story attached to it. First, let's talk about biblical English. I've started to hear this one a little more often, and let me try to summarize the viewpoint as best I can understand it. It's the idea that what I call dead words and false friends in the King James are misnomers. I shouldn't be giving modern readers a break by blaming language change for their misunderstandings. They just need to learn biblical English, which the King James alone uses. Another idea that seems to get mixed up here is that when we read the King James Version, we're not dealing with English from a long time ago, English that isn't used anymore. We're dealing with timeless English, biblical English, English that will last forever. Now, I try to be patient in my replies to critics, I really do, but my first response in this particular case can only be that this is near complete balderdash. But my second response is that it isn't complete balderdash. They are onto something. The idea of biblical English is almost totally wrong because there is and can be no such thing as timeless English. Once you write even a few paragraphs of English, your English can be dated to a time. Once you say them out loud, your English can be narrowed to a place, the US, or Britain, Canada, Singapore. A language is a group of people who agree to understand one another, and today's English is a jumble of regional dialects and accents that span the world. They're all pretty well mutually intelligible, except at the margins, or we wouldn't call them English. But they do differ. They overlap substantially, but they differ. I just never cease to be fascinated by language. It's such an amazing gift of God. King James Version English is very much datable to a time, the early 1600s, and really the late 1500s because the King James Version is a revision of the 1568 Bishop's Bible, which is itself a revision of Tyndale's work from the early 1500s. It's datable, in other words, to the Elizabethan period of English. And King James English is very much locatable to a place, the elite educated circles of Britain. Repeatedly, when the Oxford English Dictionary labels individual King James words and King James senses as archaic or obsolete, they give example citations of those same words and senses from outside the Bible. In other words, these words and senses that are now archaic and obsolete are just the ways that people talk and wrote back then. There's nothing especially biblical about saying, "How long halt ye between two opinions?" instead of, "How long will you go limping between two opinions?" Halt isn't biblical English, and go limping isn't unbiblical or non-biblical English. Using the word halt to mean limp, the way the King James translators did, or using the word communicate to mean share goods rather than just share words, this is not biblical English, it's turn of the 17th century English. Biblical English is something people talk and tweet about, but that doesn't make it real. It's about as real as K.Q.E.D. However, people who claim the existence of biblical English are onto something, and it's basically this. The King James is often a highly literal or formal translation. It mimics the forms of the Hebrew and Greek. And sometimes, not always, it chooses to go literal even when a literal translation could yield a misunderstanding. The King James follows the Greek and Hebrew word order sometimes when following English word order would be easier to understand. And I could see someone calling that biblical English. It's English that no one would ever produce on their own. It exists only in translations from other languages. Also, the King James Version seems to me to default to literal translation of phrases that may or may not be idioms. We don't always know when a biblical phrase was a common saying, a stock phrase, an idiomatic expression. And for an example of such a thing, let us now turn to "fell on his neck." This phrase comes from the amazingly rich parable of the Prodigal Son, told by Jesus in Luke 15. Right at one of the key moments of high drama, Jesus says, and here's the King James Version, "And he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him." That's Luke 15:20. There's a kind of contextual conflict here. Anybody with a modicum of reading skill and world awareness should realize that the father didn't literally fall on his own neck and then, kiss the prodigal son's ankles or something from the ground. But I still wrote about this phrase in my book, Authorized, because in my judgment, it could and would be misunderstood by some readers. And I had heard a story in which a translator had done this very thing during a sermon. It was somebody who was signing, and when the preacher said, "and he fell on his neck and kissed him," the signer did whatever signs are necessary. Sorry to botch it, I don't know sign language. That meant he fell literally on his neck and kissed him. Surprise, surprise, someone on the internet did not like this. I got mocked on Facebook by someone I've never met personally for suggesting that any reader might be so dumb as to misunderstand this phrase. I was insulting people's intelligence or simply revealing my own density, to use the critic's own word. Now, I certainly do have my own density. I am a solid, and sometimes I am a little too thick. I'm not denying this. Underneath my celebratory announcement that my Faith Life film, Authorized, had arrived, he challenged me and my friends. He said, quote, "Has anyone here ever encountered a King James reader who thought that Luke 15:20 means that the prodigal's father fell down and hit his own neck and then kissed his son from the ground? Double question mark. Double question marks mean rank skepticism. But my friends, quite a lot of whom grew up reading the King James Version like I did, came through for me. They started chiming in. One who gave permission for his name to be included in this video, my good friend Timothy Berg, whose website KJVhistory.com you should definitely check out, wrote, "I can't speak to anyone else, but I always read the phrase that way as a kid and teen. It occurs in several passages, not just this one. The ordering of the words always felt weird, so I sort of transposed them in my mind as he fell down and kissed him on his neck. But still always pictured two grown men on the ground kissing each other's necks. It was an uncomfortable image, but one I always chalked up to the differences of ancient culture. I had no plans to roll on the ground kissing my brother's neck. I grew up in King James-only circles. That was the common understanding of all of us, that I recall. I recall finally coming to realize that wasn't what it meant when using a decent commentary. I was quite relieved to realize my mental image was a false one." To his credit, the would-be challenger, my critic, accepted this answer. Someone else piped up. Quote, "That is absolutely what I thought it meant when I was a child. Well, that or that he fell on his son's neck, vampire style. Not joking. For what it's worth, I have a PhD in literature and have no particular dog in this race. I like the King James as a literary and historical text, but tend to read more contemporary translations. You'll find that any texts of early modern English, such as Shakespeare, tend to be increasingly lined with glosses, definitions of words whose meaning has transformed or disappeared since the time of writing. The King James is an early modern English text, so there's really nothing mystifying here. Perhaps you can clarify why you're so firm in holding to the other side of this discussion? Now, I can't remember for sure, but I don't believe I personally ever misunderstood this phrase, fell on his neck. Even as a small child, the context made this scene clear in my mind. And if you check the Greek, it quite literally says, fell on his neck. The King James translators made no error. In fact, the New King James Version and several other contemporary Bibles still read this way. The same phrase occurs in Genesis 45:14, when Joseph fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. And that, too, is what the Hebrew literally says. This is what I would call biblical English. It's a special brand of translation English, remember, that, again, no one would ever say, unless their English has been influenced by Bible translations like the King James, which of course does happen because the King James has been so influential. The King James Version has turned some biblical English, like by the skin of my teeth, into normal English. We didn't have that phrase before English Bible translation gave it to us. All this illustrates a related truth that I've tried to make clear. Not all false friends are false friends to all readers, but if a lot of people, a few of whom chimed in on my Facebook feed, have the same misunderstanding, it's right to check to see if antiquated English isn't the problem. But it's when you do this with this phrase, fell on his neck from Luke 15, that the story gets more complex. Hebrew and Greek say fell on his neck, like I said, and I think it is absolutely fine to translate the phrase that way. If this is a kind of false friend, it isn't one due to language change only. It's due to culture. We don't fall on one another's necks anymore. At least we don't describe emotional hugs that way. Merriam-Webster and the American Heritage Dictionary don't appear to me to record this sense of fell on. That is, we might do the same thing that biblical people did in emotionally charged situations, although I'm not so sure about that because I've seen modern Israeli television and the way the men hang on each other is just totally different from what we do in America. But we wouldn't use this terminology, fell on his neck, to describe it. The Oxford English Dictionary, which I have up on my shelf up there, perhaps doesn't tell the whole story, but my guess is that the Elizabethans didn't talk this way either. Later English speakers, influenced by the King James Version, have at times used this language, but modern American English speakers at least now don't. So, most modern translations don't read this way in either passage I've mentioned. They read that the father in Luke 15 embraced him or threw his arms around his neck. They read that Joseph threw his arms around Benjamin. That's how we'd say this in our English. That's our equivalent idiom. This story is complex because I can't really say that this misunderstanding is a result of language change. Maybe it is. I haven't been able to determine that with certainty, but my gut, plus the Google Ngram viewer, says no. This really doesn't fit in the category of what I call false friends. But it is a misunderstanding created because the King James translators and other translators before them and now after them, including the Bishop's Bible that they were revising and Tyndale and Wycliffe before them, decided to choose a literal rendering of this phrase instead of one that made sense to English speakers. At least it's clear to me today that some people misunderstand it. Fell on his neck, if it's a kind of false friend, is one between English and Biblish, not between our English and King James Elizabethan English. Biblish is perhaps a better way to describe biblical English. Biblish, or sometimes we say Greeklish or Hebrewlish, is a translation into any language that is so literal, even with the idioms, the figures of speech, that people don't always understand it. Like, Mary was found in stomach having, which is what the Greek literally says. We would say instead, Mary was pregnant. The King James translators here definitely did not opt for Biblish, biblical English. They wrote what was culturally and linguistically appropriate for them. But it's decidedly not what the Greek says. They wrote that Mary was great with child. Great and child are not in the Greek. In general, I'm for being as literal or formal as possible in most Bible translations used by middle-class Christians. But that's pretty much what everyone in the major modern evangelical English Bible translation world says they're doing, from the English Standard Version to the NIV. They just have different levels of sensitivity to what possible means. Some people say that we ought to make readers travel into the world of the text, not bring the text into their world. The more formal translations generally lean toward this perspective. Other people say that if a little kid in Kansas is apt to think that the prodigal son and his father were kissing one another's necks on the ground, maybe we shouldn't be literal here. That's how I feel, even though I wasn't that kid. Better safe than sorry with this one. But here's the great thing. Nobody is making anybody else read only the really literal translations or only the somewhat less literal ones, other than King James onlyists. Why does it have to be either or when it can be both and? And that's the lesson in all my False Friends videos. The lesson is not chuck your King James in the dumpster. It's read all the high-quality evangelical English Bible translations you feasibly can. Or at the very least, it's read a formal translation and a less formal one on a regular basis, perhaps in alternating years. If you do this with attention, I guarantee you will start to notice things you misunderstood when you read only the King James. And after a longer while, you start to intuitively understand why translations differ when they do. When you spot differences, there's always an opportunity for learning. Don't pass it up. Now hopefully thou understandest what thou readest in the King James Version a little better.